All right, well, let's jump in. So we are in Mark chapter 6, and we have arrived to the story of Jesus walking on the water. And so we just barely touched on this, so let's pick up there. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side to Bethsaida, where he dismissed the crowd. After saying farewell to them, he went up on the mountain to pray. When evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. When he saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, he came toward them early in the morning, walking on the sea. He intended to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. All right, so when we talked about Jesus calming the sea in a previous passage, we did a little contextual work on the Sea of Galilee. And so if you were here for that, you may remember that the Sea of Galilee actually isn't that big. It's one of the great moments of traveling to the Holy Land when you can be on the Sea of Galilee and realize that when you're in the middle of it, you can actually kind of see shore all the way across. And so to cross from one side of Galilee to the other isn't that long. And so that creates some context for knowing, but the fears are still real, of course. This isn't great advanced seamanship in terms of what vessels they had. And so things could be overturned at any moment. And so they're out in the middle of the sea. Remember, the Gospel of Mark is taking us from one place to another as quickly as possible. And so it has Jesus in one passage on one side of the sea and then another passage traveling to the other side. He's probably not traveling at such great speed. However, it does cue us into the fact that Jesus is going from Jewish territory into Greek territory, which would have been surprising for his fellow followers of Judaism, that he would be entering into territory of Gentiles. And so it's in the midst of all of this sea travel that there's this moment where the crowd is dismissed. He's taking one of his typical respites, and he's going to a mountain to pray. That's a theme we see a lot in terms of Jesus taking advantage of moments to get away. But then he comes and he's going to pass them by. This is such a very strange passage that Jesus is walking on the water. They think it's a ghost. And then he says these words, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." What do you all make of this passage? Seems almost kind of a throwaway to be so short when the miracle is so grand. Someone is defying the laws of physics to walk on the water.
I'm sorry, aren't these guys fishermen?
They're fishermen, some of them.
Why are they afraid of the sea being rough? I mean,
You'd think they would be used to it. They've experienced this before. But again, no one wants to die. And so maybe it's a little rough. And so you would think they were used to it. That's a great question.
I'm struck by he intended to pass them by. I don't ever recall reading that before. It's a big deal because that means he's doing whatever this magical thing is, this miraculous thing, without doing it to come and save them. I don't know if he's going to go by and wave and impress them, or whether he's just doing his thing.
Shirley says she's struck by the line that Jesus is intending to pass them by. That stood out to me more so than it does usually as well. Maybe that's something we haven't noticed before, almost as if there's no purpose to this. Jesus isn't doing this. Could he have been walking on a sandbar? Great question. I saw that and I thought it was a setup to a joke that Jesus was walking into a bar. But could he have been walking on a sandbar? Let me get to that in just a quick moment here. But that's a great point, something to observe. It doesn't seem like he's doing this for any purpose or that he has some end in mind to show them this miraculous action. He's just kind of heading on the water, doing his thing. Yeah. So Jackie, your question, could he have been walking on a sandbar? Again, we talked about this in the healing of, we have so many demon possession stories that we can approach these in two different ways. We could, of course, take the approach where we think, okay, we need some sort of explanation for what's happening in terms of how this could take place in the natural world. And so there are lots of theories, something like a sandbar, or there were theories that in the early morning, there were places in the water where rocks were prevalent, or perhaps there were places where the water had frozen, depending on what time of year it was. And so there's all of these ways to think about the natural phenomenon and what could have allowed Jesus to walk on water without actually walking on water. So we could definitely take that approach. Or we could take the approach where we are just kind of mystified by the divine nature of Christ. That's what the author definitely wants us to do. Mark chapter 1, the purpose of this is for us to understand Jesus as the Christ, so we get all these vignettes of Jesus doing something out of the ordinary. And again, I think the point of having this story, which to me almost seems throwaway in its brevity, just to remind us that even the disciples who are privy to the greatest miracles of Christ, here walking on water, and it tells us that they still don't understand the story of the loaves, that somehow food could be multiplied. Was that actual food being divided? Or last week we talked about, was it just the miracle that happens when we share our resources and realize we have more than enough for everyone when it comes down to it? Either way we approach it, the disciples still don't understand what it is that Jesus is trying to accomplish. And so we're reading this and we're putting ourselves in the disciples' shoes as well. We don't get to witness Jesus walking on water and have that advantage. And so we can understand why we might be a little confused and need more time, more evidence, more research, more time to sit with the miraculousness of who Jesus is. Any other observations or questions on this passage? Yeah, Kevin.
I'm struck too by that.
Oh.
It's so odd because it's like he sees that they're struggling, so he heads toward them, but not to help.
Yeah.
So it's obvious about God, but it seems like what he wants is for them to see the walking.
Yeah. Another great observation, Kevin says, not only struck by, intended to pass them by, but notice right before that in verse 48, his impetus for going onto the water is because he sees them straining at the oars. And so if he's walking past in order to help them while they're straining at the oars, is it so that they will calm down and realize they're following someone who's bigger than the waves? Is it so that they'll have the confidence to step out themselves, as we'll see in another telling in a different gospel? So that's a great question. Yeah, Jesus, why are you intending to pass them by? And how did the author know this?
I think that kind of like when we all struggle, Jesus is there. And they get to see Jesus.
Wow.
But we don't often see that we go there in our lives. And I think maybe he wanted them to call
Wow. Jennifer makes a great point that, we have these moments when we're straining at the oars, when life is tough, when we're anxious, when we're facing hardships, and to recognize that, quote unquote, Jesus is passing us by, or Jesus is right there, Jesus is walking alongside of us. Just kind of that recognition in that moment is sometimes enough to help us realize we can make it through that moment. I really like that. Yeah, Janet.
No, but I'm still back on the part of the
Great. Yeah, picking up Jackie in the chat, you asked that question as well. What does it mean that their hearts were hardened? This is one of the most mysterious phrases in all of Scripture that scholars have done in-depth language studies in, because it is most profoundly used in the story of the Exodus, when Moses enacts the 10 plagues on behalf of God, and Pharaoh relents and allows the Israelites to leave, and yet Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Both it receives the active and the passive voice. So who's doing the hardening? Is it God hardening? And if so, why is God hardening Pharaoh's hearts on purpose? This is actually picked up later in the New Testament to play with that idea of what does it mean for someone's heart to be hardened. And so that is an hour lecture unto itself. But all that to say is there is a common theme here, that sometimes there are layers to our own belief and faith, that there can be both internal and external forces that prevent us from seeing the reality of the work of God. Not necessarily that God is the one doing that hardening, but that there are ways in which we allow our heart to be hardened, by the distractions of wealth. That's something we picked up in a previous passage in Mark, the parable of the sower. Just our own unbelief, our own inability to accept something that doesn't adhere to our previously held worldview, that all of that can be layers that keep our hearts hardened. So great question from Janet and Jackie. What does it mean for their hearts to be hardened? It's simply that there's more work to be done on these people to get them to a place where they can believe.
That, I mean, he said, well, they went ahead to the other side. So they
Mm.
presumably they're coming back to pick him up. And this adverse wind is preventing them from coming and getting him. And he's going out to meet them. And I'm thinking of it similar to what I thought before, was maybe the message was also, we think we know how to help God. We think we know how to do this task of serving God, but, you know, it could be handled whether we've got it.
I really like that, Shirley. So Shirley's comment for the folks online in the room here is that it says that Jesus sent them to the other side. So they're attempting to go there to meet him, and yet he's going out to meet them. And as they're straining, trying to get to Jesus, Shirley is bringing that into understanding that sometimes we think we know what it means to serve God or work for God, but we don't always have that right. And Jesus can change our expectations of that. Bob says, noteworthy that miraculous occurrences were not unique to Jesus, also reported in various Eastern religions. I read a book years ago by a Russian Orthodox author who talked about a visit to a hermitage in Russia where the monks came walking across a lake. Great observation, Bob, and this also ties in to our discussion in a previous week about the historical Jesus, and that there's a lot of work being done to try to figure out who was Jesus exactly, because he wasn't the only miracle worker in first century Palestine. And so there's reasons why people assign him to, he was a sage, he was a rabbi, he was a miracle worker, because there's other sort of magical work being done by people as a profession. And so the author of the Gospel of Mark is wanting us to kind of get a composite picture, that it's not just one. Sure, Jesus says, you come to me because you've seen these miracles, but my message is more than that. So the message is not just the miracles, even though we get a lot of miracle stories. Great observation, Bob. All right, anything else? Wonderful. Okay. Healing the sick in Ganesaret. When they had crossed over, they came to land at Ganesaret and moored the boat. When they got out of the boat, people at once recognized him and rushed about the whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed.
This is the Greek side, right?
This is the Greek side, Ganesaret, yes. So this is the area, the Gerasene, where that whole healing of the demoniac in a previous chapter took place. So we're here. And so clearly the this was just, chapter 5 was the healing of the demoniac. And so Jesus tells that person to go spread the news about him in this region, and we wondered why he did that when he tells so many other people not to say anything. Clearly, this gentleman did good work here because he goes back to the region for the first time since, and everyone in the region knows who he is and rushes to him. I'm assuming that the reason for this passage is twofold. One, for that very reason, to tell us that this one man who experienced the work of Christ in his life was so ecstatic about that experience that the news of Jesus's work spread, and also to continue to play around with that idea of the secret of the Gospel of Mark, or the messianic secret, that we're wondering why Jesus doesn't want people to share the news, and yet this is the result, is that he can barely move through the region because everyone is coming to be healed by him. And again, his message is beyond the experience of bodily healing.
It seems like it had less of social conferences.
Ah.
Jews had, well, they had the traditions they had.
Mm.
And so.
Wow.
I feel like the Greeks were more open to
Wow. Yeah, great observation. Jackie, you're asking a similar question. So Jennifer's question was, it seems like the folks in the Greek region have less encumbrances to approaching Jesus. Jackie says, does that mean the Greeks believed in him more than his own people? That, I think, is another great point that this passage may be suggesting. One, yes, there was less encumbrances, because with the healing of the woman with the flow of blood, or those with skin diseases, these are individuals who weren't allowed to go into society. They were expected to stay outside of the walls of the city of Jerusalem. And yet here they are coming to Jesus, touching Jesus. So there is less social encumbrances because of customs and expectations. And we already had that passage where a prophet isn't welcome in his hometown. And so it's a little more skepticism when you know the person. I grew up with this guy. I know his parents. I know his brothers. How could he be the Messiah? And so Jesus is experiencing less of that. Going back, Mel, to your comment, Jesus was called a zealot. That was a group of people who were trying to violently overthrow the Roman government. Yes, he was also seen in that historical Jesus study as a zealot. Ganesaret is on the western shore of Lake Galilee. Thank you, Mel. And so there's a lot happening in Jesus's world here in the midst of trying to proclaim this message. Any other thoughts on this passage? All right. The tradition of the elders. Okay, so we're into chapter 7 now. Okay. Two of my favorite passages close out Mark 7. See if we can touch on them. Okay, let's start with the tradition of the elders, though. Now, when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around him, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash. And there were also many other traditions that they observed, the washing of cups and pots and bronze kettles and beds. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands? He said to them, Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites. As it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition. Then he said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to keep your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and whoever speaks evil of father or mother must surely die. But you say that if anyone tells father or mother, whatever support you might have had from me is Corban, that is an offering to God, then you no longer permit doing anything for a father or mother, thus nullifying the word of God through your tradition that you have handed on, and you do many things like this. Then he called the crowd again and said to them, listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. When he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about the parable. He said to them, so, are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart, but the stomach, and goes out into the sewer? Thus he declared all foods clean. And he said, it is what comes out of a person that defiles. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, debauchery, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. All right, that's quite a lengthy exchange for the Gospel of Mark, when it's mostly action and not dialogue. And he's having this repartee with the Pharisees, the scribes, those who were responsible for teaching and carrying on the traditions and laws of Judaism that had developed and built up over time. I think what's interesting here is that in a previous passage, the Pharisees go to Jesus and blame him for the work of his disciples. Now they're trying a different tactic. They're coming around and they're coming to the disciples. I'm sorry, they went to the disciples and asked them about Jesus. Now they're coming to Jesus and asking him about his disciples. Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders? So there clearly would have been, and we know this today, that if you are to participate in a Shabbat dinner, that there are ritual hand washing moments in the dinner that you go through in order to purify yourself to receive the meal. And so this is happening at that time as well, that you are supposed to wash your hands before you eat anything. And so people are seeing that the disciples aren't living into these observation and their laws. And so they come to Jesus, and Jesus uses it as this teaching moment that you can obey all the laws, you can say all the right things, you can take all the right actions, but if your heart is not oriented in the right place, then it is abandoning the commandments of God. And so the writers of the gospel put in several caveats that Jesus is not here to do away with Judaism. He's not establishing a new religion. He doesn't understand himself to be establishing a new religion. Instead, what the gospel writers are seeing is that he is helping to illuminate what the spirit of the law is rather than the letter of the law, or what does it mean to truly practice the faith of Judaism. So this isn't meant to be a condemnation of Judaism. There's going to be readings later in history, particularly around the Gospel of John, that become very anti-Semitic. There are going to be lots of disputes within early Judaism about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Does one have to convert to Judaism first in order to follow Jesus? Or can someone remain a Gentile, a non-Jewish practitioner, and also be a follower of Jesus? So those debates are coming. We get a little snippet of that put into it. If you'll notice in verse 19, where it says, thus he declared all foods clean, that's not something that happens until later in Christian history. And so the authors are saying, wait a minute, later we get this message that all foods are clean. Maybe when Jesus said this, that's what he meant. And so that's why it's a little parenthetical insertion that they're interpreting going backwards into what Jesus was saying. So Jesus is making this grand declaration. I think this is a really great example of what Jesus means by trying to get to the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law, that this idea of korban, an offering to God, that there's two things actually. One, that there was the practice of an actual tithe, that 10% of anything that you had, whether it was a harvest or financial gain, that you would give that back to the work of God in the temple. And so there's another passage where Jesus is saying a very similar critique to the Pharisees. And he talks about how they take their dill and their cumin and they measure it. And you know, dill and cumin, you've got these tiny little seeds, and they would make sure that they calculated exactly a tenth. And they were so caught up in ensuring that all of their dill seeds were properly apportioned that they missed everything else that was going on in the kingdom of God and the work that God was doing. And what he's saying here is what Korban was, is that you could do it above and beyond 10% and say that this money that I would have used for other purposes is now being allocated to the work of God. And so Jesus is saying, look, you're supposed to honor your father and your mother, and they're dependent on you in this situation, and they need your help. And you're telling them, well, I would help you, but the money I was going to give you is now an offering to God, and you feel righteous for doing that, and yet you're completely neglecting your obligation to care for your parents. I think that's a really good example. I'm curious what other examples you might have of ways today we often get caught up in the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law.
This is Mel.
Mel?
I am struck by how the wealthy lobby effectively to write the tax laws to benefit themselves. The carried interest portion of this last inflation fighting bill that Biden just signed, Kristen Sinema insisted that the carry forward interest that cuts in half the taxes for the rich Um, so laws are often written by the rich and powerful, and then they turn around and say, I'm paying everything the law requires.
Interesting. And that was certainly a tactic being taken by religious authorities here, is that there's another passage where Jesus says that you heap up new laws on converts, that you weigh them down, and the burdens are so heavy that they can't even move. And so they're kind of the ones coming up with all of these ideas of what it means to be a practitioner of the faith, that the burden becomes so overly heavy. I think that's a great observation, Mel. What are ways in which laws are written so that you can obey them because they're advantageous to you? Yeah, great observation. I bet, yeah, Shirley.
Well, way back when, as a young Catholic, getting engaged to someone and then finding out that there were issues and finding out that there's a whole priestly system of legal church matters where the priests know how to circumvent when you may or may not marry someone, how to get around whatever their rules are. And it really hit home that there's something twisted about this.
Wow, interesting. Yeah, Shirley was saying that in her background in the Catholic Church, just realizing that there's always loopholes for the right person in terms of how you apply the laws. Mel, you said modern meaning of Pharisaic, meaning self-righteous or hypocritical. Yeah, I think we definitely see that, and I think we're all guilty of that, of having these expectations and rules. But in the moment when you need the loophole, that loophole is there for sure. And that's maybe something for us to keep pondering, because I'm sure there are so many ways in which the church has used laws surrounding things like divorce and marriage, or to oppress rather than to lift people up, to enable the flourishing of humanity, which is something I'm going to talk about in the sermon in just a moment. And I think we get in trouble on the opposite end of the spectrum too, that when it comes to things like Sabbath observance, where Jesus says, when he's explaining why he's healing on the Sabbath, look, if your ox was stuck in a ditch, you would take the time to help your ox out of the ditch. And so if you have an ox in the ditch moment, like, it's okay not to take this Sabbath rest. But I think we get into trouble when we're living into the spirit of the law maybe too much and fail to see its own benefit for our lives as well. So I think both ends of the spectrum. Yeah, Harry.
Think about American world about Christianity. Religious to indigenous people, but you kill them. But a lot of Christians will say, well, it's not that, but so it's kind of.
Wow. Yeah. So Harry said that in the history of colonialism, when the colonists come and they bring this new religion and they are proselytizing the name of Christ while at the same time stealing wealth and land and killing people. And then in the modern context, we say, oh, well, now we know all that is bad, but look, Christianity has spread. Yeah, that's a really great example of the ways in which none of that is justified, right? Like the spread of Christianity can never be justified, can never be used as a justification for any of those actions. And the oppression of indigenous rituals and traditions that very much bring people closer to God, to wipe those out and not see that there's ways to even just bring in those cultural forms of worship into a very enriching life of the way we relate to God. That's a really great observation. Any other comments or thoughts on this passage? Yeah. I mean, this is a pretty good message here from Jesus. Paul's going to pick this back up when early Christians are afraid to eat in temples where food has been sacrificed to idols. And Paul's going to say, look, like, we don't believe in those idols. it doesn't matter. If you eat it, like nothing magical is going to happen to affect who you are. If someone around you has a problem with that, like, okay, accept that and like allow them to sit with that, but just know that nothing that enters a person defiles them. I saw a really good explanation of this when it came to the concept of swearing or cursing, that in terms of, what'd you say?
Right up my alley.
Yeah, right up your alley, Jennifer says.
I've been doing that a lot lately.
Been doing that a lot lately. That the church in its moral oversight has become obsessed, not as much now, but in decades past, with this concept of swearing or cursing, that a good moral person doesn't do that, while missing entirely the whole point of what cursing is about and the ways in which we curse the human body through racism and oppression and sexism, that those are truly curses to humanity. And we're so worried about a four-letter word that we say that has no power, and yet we're using our power to oppress. I think that's a great way to extract what Jesus is saying here. All right. One of the most confusing passages in all of Scripture. Let's see what you think about it. From there, Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, of Syrophoenician origin, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." And when she went home, she found the child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Thoughts? Initial reactions? Yeah, Joanne.
This is one of my favorite stories, because it strikes me that it points directly to the fact that Jesus was also a human, got frustrated, got tired, and forgot who he was. He
Ooh.
walks into this house, and his mission is to heal, and he's not having it. And she comes to him nicely, and he uses that phrase, which to me is very insulting because of the whole cultural thing about dogs in that.
Yeah.
And she nicely turns his words around so that he can't argue with them. And he does the right thing. He says, "You're right."
Ooh, okay.
I love this.
Wow. Okay, so Joanne says she loves the story because it gives us a glimpse into the humanness of Jesus, that even he has this moment of frustration and tiredness and anger, and he locks himself in the house and is staying away from his work of healing, and then calls this woman essentially a dog, and she, in her generosity, has to remind him of who he is and what he's about, and he comes to this realization, like, okay, yes, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. Love the way you phrased that. Really interesting. Other thoughts? Other reactions? Other takes? Yeah, Kevin?
It seems like everywhere, that's part of what's funny about this is that he finally needs somebody who understands.
Ooh.
Something that for abuses there.
Ooh, yeah.
Very excited to have somebody finally.
Okay, so he's got someone that he can have a literary banter with, because, we've talked about how these parables aren't always supposed to be these one-to-one allegories where we kind of essentialize their meaning, and she's able to pick it up and throw it back at him in a new way and make him think about what he's trying to say. Finally, someone who can talk parables with him. Love that. Did I see your hand up, Doug? Yeah. Doug says, could this passage be a suggestion that it's okay to argue against God? Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I like that observation, and there's other passages where we have this exchange with God, whether that's Moses when he's called to go to Exodus, or it's Abraham trying to save the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. There are these moments where we have God changing God's mind. That's on our list of sermon series topic ideas. When does God supposedly change God's mind, and what does that mean? And so here it seems as if Jesus is changing his mind, or being reminded of who he is, or having an exchange. Yeah, Robin.
That mission was about faith. And this one, Jesus wanted healing. She wanted her daughter to be healed. And so the use of the parable is not that children are Jews and everybody else are dogs, but children are the ones who dogs don't have faith. And that's the difference that
Wow, I like that. Yeah, we've seen that in a lot of other healing stories. What Robin said was that we have understood that Jesus's mission here is not just to stop at the physical bodily healing, but it's for people to develop faith and to understand the work of Christ. And so he's helping this person go farther in that work. She comes to him for the healing, but she leaves in this moment of faith, this understanding that the children are the people who have faith. I think that's really great. Good. These are a lot of great ideas. Yeah, Wendy.
This whole part reminds me of Fiddler on the Roof. Tevye, the poor tailor, is trying to marry Tevye's daughter, and the dad is saying, "No, you're too poor. No, you don't deserve my daughter." And he stands up. He's a scrawny-looking guy and very skinny, and he stands up and he says, "Even a poor tailor deserves some happiness."
Wow.
And he's standing up to someone who's big and powerful and has you by the throat, standing up to someone.
Yeah.
And the other thing I wanted to say is, I like the way Joanne was saying about God saying, or Jesus saying that, he was wrong, and he wasn't afraid to admit it. That's very powerful.
Wendy has two great observations. The first was from the Fiddler on the Roof, when the poor tailor trying to marry one of Tevye's daughters stands up and says, even a poor tailor deserves happiness. And for someone to stand up to another person in a position of power and to make that declaration is powerful to Wendy. And so too, she's reiterating Joanne's comment that for Jesus to be able to have this moment of realizing that he's getting the story wrong is powerful to her as well. Jackie, let's see, we got a few comments here in the chat. Jesus was delighted that this woman understood the message was not just for the Jews. He also discerned her faith and helped reveal it to everyone. Thanks, Bob. Jackie, it is in contrast to the tradition of the men eating first, because he says, let the child eat first. Oh, interesting. Great observation. That it leaves the men and the women out of the equation, and it goes to the children. And then after the children come the dogs. There was definitely a hierarchy of dining, and that's being subverted here. These are all really great observations, and I like to think that they're all right. We're not given, yeah, go ahead, Shirley.
More, I suspect some of his disciples were with him, even though it doesn't say that, because this is an observed situation. He went outside and said, "Disciples, I gotta tell you this big mistake I made." So, I mean, it could have happened, but it's also more likely that they saw it, and so this may have also been for them to understand.
Shirley says this could be an object lesson for the disciples, because either, knowing that this story is included, either it was observed or Jesus would have had to say, hey, I want to tell you about a big mistake I just made. That's a great observation. Could this be an object lesson? So this is classified as one of the more difficult to interpret passages, because it does seem so outside of the character of Jesus to claim that someone can't receive his ministry because they are equivalent to a dog compared to the children of Israel. And so I kind of like all of these interpretations. I think they're all great. Adding to those observations is along the lines of what Shirley is saying. To what degree could this have been an object lesson of helping people understand that there was this great belief that the Messiah was coming solely for the Jewish people and that his mission would have been to the Jewish people? We've already seen Jesus travel into the Decapolis, into the region of the Gerasenes, and do ministry there, reaching out to the Gentiles. And so is this another reminder to those listening that the people who you think are dogs are actually equivalent to the children of Israel and just as important in the ministry work that I'm doing? And I think this is important too when we think about the concepts of dehumanization, that throughout history, we dehumanize people when we classify them as dogs or animals. We say, don't treat them like dogs, don't treat them like animals. But what that suggests is that there are degrading ways that we treat dogs and animals that are okay. And so when we get into that sort of speciesism, then that gets us into trouble as well, because we have this dichotomy of how humans are treated, how dogs are treated, how animals are treated. But when we break down that distinction as well, when every living creature deserves equitable care, then that kind of breaks down that concept as well. But to someone who said something about the treatment of dogs in this culture, not a lot of domesticization. Did I say that right? And so, yeah, dogs probably would have been treated much more poorly. Another observation over here. Did I see a hand? No? Okay. All right. This is a great passage to just chew on. You are doing that so effectively and so well. So thank you for that. In the USMC, enlisted people eat before the officers. Interesting. Thanks for that, Mel. All right. So if you listen to the sermon on March 15th, 2020, first sermon of the pandemic, I preached on this passage. Coming from a family of genetic deafness, obviously this passage is of great interest and I have lots to say about it. So we'll try to be succinct as we kick off the passage next week. But I think this is going to tie into, Robin, what you were saying about what is the purpose of these healing stories in terms of faith, in terms of wholeness. There's a lot here in that passage about what Jesus is trying to accomplish beyond physical healing. So we'll kick off next week with this passage. Any other concluding comments or thoughts?
I just have it with the Stephen minister. A lot of times working with people, we go with a presenting need. And working on that presenting need, and by the time we're done, we dealt with a lot of spiritual issues that were never the presenting need, but the people are very grateful that their faith has grown.
Wow.
Usually our faith grows as well.
Wow. Shirley says working as a Stephen minister, and what that is people who've gone through really intense training to volunteer to walk with people through difficult moments in life. So someone's going through the loss of a loved one or loss of a job, they can have a Stephen minister to meet with them once a week and talk through what's going on. And Shirley, you probably said something that psychologists and therapists in the room professionally would very much agree with, that people come with a presenting issue, and then you end up talking about so many other spiritual, emotional issues that they're thankful to have talked about, even though they thought this was the issue. Here's all the other issues. Yeah, that's definitely what Jesus is doing in terms of focusing on holistic healing. All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll continue on next week. All right. Farewell, Zoomers.